Hi, everyone. It's great to see you, and hello to everyone online. So Justin and I will just briefly introduce ourselves, and really we want to get started hearing from our panelists. We work in educational technology services, so if you have questions about any of the tools that are being discussed today, feel free to reach out to us. I'm Freedom Baird, Senior Educational Technology Specialist.
And I am Justin Horvath, also Senior Educational Technology Specialist. So we're going to hand it over to the faculty members. You guys are just going to introduce yourselves. We have a short presentation. I have the slide advancer here, so just let me know. And it goes in order with 1, 2, 3. And also, just thinking about the keynote already, when you're done, could you just let us know, do you think you're in the adopt, critique, or embrace category? I'm just throwing this at them right now.
And I also just want to add that we are so excited to have these 3 faculty members in particular presenting to you, because they are doing really interesting, innovative things. And we've been talking with them really for the past year about the work they've been doing. And so we really appreciate them being here.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, my name is Mira Gatlin, and I'm a public health veterinarian and assistant teaching professor at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. So I came all the way out here from Grafton, which is my excuse for walking in a little bit late. And I'm going to talk to you about AI and active learning in veterinary public health. Do you want me to just go into my slides? Do you want everybody to introduce themselves?
Just go ahead and go into your slides.
Wonderful. If you could advance, please. Okay. So I decided to use AI in one of my classes back at the beginning of the semester. And I teach a very interdisciplinary topic. It's a very specific topic, public health to veterinary professionals, students that are about to be veterinarians. And it's a 4-year dual degree program. It's a combination, a collaborative program between the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine and the Tufts School of Medicine, Public Health and Community Medicine Department. And I run an integration seminar for these students. I only have about 10 students currently in the program. It's a very small cohort, smaller than it's been previously. And I picked my integration seminar for a few reasons. One was it's a small cohort of students. It's an evening seminar that I run once a month. And so engagement is really challenging. And I thought AI might be a great way to think about, adding just another creative tool to the topics. And the students have a lot of stake in this class. Like, they get to pick some of the topics, and I'll talk about the lessons I picked and why. And the use of AI here was optional as well. Again, because it's a small cohort, there's a lot of creativity in the way that they can use and engage with the material. So it's a once a month seminar. I had 4 classes this past semester, and I will do 4 more in the spring. And so you can see the 4 classes here listed on the left. We started with current events because that's kind of a nice, easy introduction to the course, particularly for my first years. And I do an introduction, and then we go into current events. I found AI was not a very good tool for that, especially when using models like the free ChatGPT, because its training concludes in September 2021. So that was but it's a good learning tool for me. Nonetheless. And so I decided for the remainder of the semester to find ways of active learning. And I credit a lot of that myself to CELT, because I learned a lot of these techniques through engagement with CELT. And I paired up these active learning techniques with using AI for these particular topics. So the next class I picked was disease eradication. So it was a focus on infectious diseases, and the 2 diseases we have successfully eradicated in public health, one human disease and one animal disease. And I gave about a 45-minute primer, a sort of lecture-based presentation to the students. And then we spent the remainder of the time engaging with AI and using what's called Think, Pair, Share. And so traditionally, this active learning is where students will individually brainstorm, pair up with a partner, and then share in the class. But instead, I had them pair with AI. And the question I posed to them in this disease eradication topic was, which disease would you prioritize for eradication? So I had them individually brainstorm. And these are veterinary students, so they'll often focus on zoonotic diseases or diseases of primary importance to animal health. And then I had them query AI and see how do they tailor some of their prompts and responses to AI. So their pairing was with AI, and then we shared it as a class. And we did activities and sticky notes and everything. We got to compare the different sticky notes with 2 different colors about what they brainstormed versus what AI provided. And then they proceeded to sort of critique some of the responses. Why is this a priority, or why is this not a priority based on what I just presented. Next lecture I gave was Government 101. This was actually at the request of a student who had a lot of difficulty understanding the federal government's roles and responsibilities towards public health and specifically veterinary public health. So I had them concept map. And I gave them each topics, and I had them pair up. And so they had to concept map topics such as management of live animals, deceased animals, and food. animals used for food production, and then drugs and biologics. And I had them, I presented it based on the government agency, and then I had them concept map these topics just because there is inherently a lot of overlap with these particular topics. And then again, about a 45-minute lecture, and we spent the rest of the 2 hours, the remainder hour 15, going over their concept maps, what worked, what didn't. And a lot of students were like, what do you mean by a concept map? Like, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, ask AI. And it's interesting because concept mapping is a visual tool, but AI, particularly ChatGPT is what we were using around this time, doesn't really provide that, but it outlines it nicely. And I said, is the outline sufficient or not for you to understand what a concept map is? And then go ahead and ask AI, what is the USDA responsible for? What is the CDC responsible for? And how does the answers provided align or not align with your concept map or reshape your concept map? So that's what we did for that one. And then finally, just last week, we had our final session this semester with the Journal Club, and the topic was antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. And I had them, they selected their paper, and I had them just come prepared with their reading. And then I used the Socratic method, and I just straight up asked them questions. There was no primer or anything, but we used AI. And I said, if you don't understand what I'm asking, put it into AI and see what AI says. And this time I got to play with Anthropic's Cloud. And so that was a really interesting tool because you can upload PDFs into it as well. And again, if students didn't understand what I meant by internal validity or external validity, could you infer by asking AI and understanding what that definition is? Because a lot of them don't remember from their stats class. And then could you then comment on AI's output and then what you recall from that? So that was a really engaging discussion. And then we'll just advance one more, just in the interest of time. So themes and lessons learned. In terms of usage, I teach graduate students, these are professional degree students, and their use of AI is really variable. I have some students that are really engaged and really passionate about it, but they primarily use it for brainstorming and outlining. And then I have other students that are really quite wary of it, but using AI in the class is a nice, again, low stakes way of getting them to consider it. And if they didn't feel comfortable, they could just use my account or pair up with somebody so that they could try it out without having to feel like they needed to sign up. Spectrum of learning. And I think our keynote speakers touched on this, but this idea of getting these graduate students and these future healthcare providers to think about using AI for conceptual understanding, asking it something like, I don't understand glomerular filtration rate. Could you please define that to me, versus synthesizing some of the concepts, particularly in veterinary public health, because it's so interdisciplinary. So it's really interesting to apply AI to a spectrum of learning. The value of prompts. This is probably the biggest thing I've learned, and I encourage you all to think about, is these prompts are still human derived. And so I think there's value in asking students, what prompts did you use and how did you refine those prompts to shape your learning and the AI output? And so GIGO or GIGO is, I think, a computer science term where it's garbage in, garbage out. So what you put in is important for what output you receive. And I think asking students to share those prompts is incredibly important. And then recognizing AI limitations, with the disease eradication lecture, the students really interested in animal diseases and infectious diseases, but a lot of times AI would provide answers that are not relevant, particularly to what we're talking about. So how do you refine that? Where are the limitations? And what kinds of questions are you going to ask to shape those and tackle those limitations? And then finally, how do you use AI? And sort of what I've embraced this semester is cautious incorporation. So small, low stakes efforts like this, or pairing it with active learning techniques that are already established. And then transparent attribution. I do require my students to share their prompts or provide a paragraph of how they've used AI, and a small summary is fine. But any assignment, any class activity where I have not designed it, but they choose to use it on their own, I just ask them to use a citation style and then provide that learning paragraph or share their prompts if they're willing. And that goes for all of the classes I teach, not just the integration seminar. Thank you.
Great. And just before you go on, so did you think adapt, critique, or embrace? Do you think of some lots of different ways you could move with that?
That's really, I think I've embraced it. I'd say embrace is probably the biggest one. I've adapted some of my, again, my current lessons. I would have done these anyway, but I've adapted AI again with these active learning techniques thanks to CEL. And I've also critiqued it because that's what I want to see from students. How are you learning it? Learning by critiquing some of this output. So my cop out is all three, but I guess I would say embrace is probably the most important one. Yeah.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Hi, can you hear me? Awesome. Hi, I'm Rebecca Shakespeare. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy. We'll be better at aiming our mic.
I'm a lecturer in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning, and my background and training is as a geographer. I have, oh, great, outstanding. My portfolio of teaching is kind of broad in the fall semester. So I have a couple of examples for my 2 different classes. The first example I wanted to talk about is how we introduced our syllabus statement in my class called Cities in Place, Space, and Time. It's a core course and a requirement for all of the graduate students in our 2-year degree program, which is maybe like say 60, 70% of our programs. I said it's about 40 plus students in that class. And I had actually just come out of going to one of the CELT trainings on using AI in classes. And so I was like, well, we have this statement that I wrote over the summer because it felt like we should address generative AI and how people were using it. But we hadn't really talked about it in class yet. We did have an assignment that was really related to, or it seemed like it would be good to use generative AI for if I were a student who had been using generative AI. I was like, oh, we basically teed up an assignment that's really great to outsource to a generative AI. So we did an in-class exercise to look at what would happen if we use generative AI to do our homework and then reflect on what it did. So I just put a little piece of my syllabus statement here that I won't read because it's awkward to turn that way. But you can see that we prime people that they should be using it cautiously, but also that for this class, we wouldn't accept writing from it, or we ask them not to use it for submitting writing work. And then we spent a lot of time talking about it. Can I go to the next slide? Great. So we have a discussion board in our class that we introduced a couple of years ago to try and create a through line for our class week to week. And students, after every class session, a group of students will write a synopsis of what happened in class, relate it a bit to their lives, and then pose a couple of discussion questions for their colleagues to respond to over the course of the week. And then immediately before class, they get together with the team of folks who posed the discussion questions and come up with a brief, they actually act as discussants and present back the discussion that happened on the discussion board as our lead-in for our next class session. I have been using generative AI in my own just day-to-day life for a while. And so I was like, oh, hey, we've asked them to create something that basically could prime a generative AI on the subject matter that we're going to be discussing. And then we have questions. So in class, we went through an activity where we first primed generative AI in a very friendly, loving way, in case the robots come back and take over the world, and asked it, oh, hey, we're going to be talking about this topic. Here's the prompt that the students had said. And we did ask for their permission before we dropped it in. And then watched as ChatGPT on the board. We were using 4, so it was indeed very eloquent. It just sort of summarized out some of the bullet points that it took from the class that we had just had, and the discussion that our discussants had just explained, which was, I think, a lot of students had not actually seen ChatGPT or had not seen any kind of generative AI or large learning model actually operating. Some of them used it, but a lot of them had never seen it. And so it was like fun to watch that happen. So I put in what prompt they had, which was, it's class on cities, so we were talking about how could we look at different framings of history. So we were looking at 2 major histories of cities, and specifically looking at the fall of Rome. But you see that the question that they posed also asked, how would you draw from your own, like how does your perspective on history help you understand your current context? Then we spent about 10 minutes refining the prompt, like refining what ChatGPT had given us back in response to the discussion questions. We asked it to first consider itself as a graduate student who is coming back to school after working for 3 years in Boston as a community organizer, which is a profile of a lot of our graduate students. We asked it to phrase its response in the form of a blog post that was a certain length. And then we went through and we asked it to add a quote just to make it seem a bit more legitimate. Can I go to the next slide, please? So I put up on the screen just a little screenshot, and it may be a little too small, of the final response that we collectively talked ChatGPT 4 into creating for us. And the first thing that the students in our class called upon was the quote that they had selected to add to this little blog post discussing ChatGPT's experience as an organizer in Boston, and relating that to these two different narratives on the fall of Rome. And it pulled in a Jane Jacobs quote, which, if you are familiar with urban planning, Jane Jacobs is one of the major thinkers in urban planning from one perspective. And there are many perspectives in the discipline. And a student was like, well, it's very interesting they picked Jane Jacobs, because by then in the semester, we had already had a few little jokes back and forth between me and my co-instructor about our varying stances on Jane Jacobs and where she's really useful and where she falls short. And so we thought it was interesting, first of all, that that was the quote that they picked and how it almost demonstrated some of the perspective that was baked into this particular generative AI and the perspective that it was lending. So I then opened it up and I was like, hi, all of you are adults. You have done things. How have you been using generative AI? What does this mean to you? What have you been thinking about? And we ended up having a discussion first about that perspective and bias, what the AI was bringing. And some students brought up some of their own learning about how different AIs really only show a specific perspective, and maybe that isn't their voice, or maybe that isn't necessarily going to get to the points that they're interested in. We also talked about how using it might both negatively impact creativity, but also we have an artist in our class who has a friend who's been using AI specifically to be doing art in a generative way. So we got to have a little bit of discourse around that. And then we did talk about those potential uses. A lot of things that we've already talked about came up, using it to refine language when people are writing, if they're not confident writing in English or they're not confident writing in a certain style. We talked about the different tools that they're using and see generative AI come up. And then we did specifically talk about the source of the corpus. Some of my background is in critical digital work and critical geographic information systems, and thinking about where data comes from, where the information came from, and what processes went into even these answers coming out of the tool. And then we finally went through what our policies were in the class. And I thought it was funny, one of the students, and I made a note of this because I thought it was really lovely. They said, having this do our work, having this be our discussion board writer, won't let us see the radicals that we are. And we're really, I think that really encapsulates some of the findings that we got, which I also was seeing in the boards in the other room, is that this can do something for us, but it isn't necessarily going to be infused with our passion and our motivation and our direction. Can we do one more slide? Do I have like another second? Great, cool. The other thing that I wanted to chat about really briefly is how I've been using this for my geographic information systems class, where students are challenged to think spatially and apply a lot of different types of tools to analyze things in space. I find that students, as we know from learning science, like students do better when they get to try things several times, when they get a lot of iterations. But I also have a limited amount of knowledge about any given subject. So I've been using these kinds of prompts just to get examples so that I can then pull in an example for either a warm-up activity or a discussion activity, or I've used these to help me make my assessments too, of like, oh, the students are interested in this. Great. What are ways that we could apply this tool that I need to make sure that they understand to a topic of interest to them? So very recently, my latest ChatGPT log is about their final exam, which was about an advanced scenario of finding some lost penguins. And it was really delightful to be like, oh, I could do penguin themes. This is going to be great. Then I was like, but what questions can I ask about penguins in space? And it was really constructive that it just it would just produce a lot of answers. Some of them were terrible. It's very hit or miss, but it got me thinking in new ways and applying the subjects that were interesting to students to the material that was relevant to me. I will also say it's not very good at geographic stuff yet. I also run my exam questions through just to see what a student would get if they were posing the exam question to ChatGPT or like a different AI. And it's helpful for me to see where there's distinctions between the knowledge that they really need and the concepts that we're using and what this kind of a tool will give them back. I would say that I am in my teaching in the adopt and critique phase, and in my day-to-day life in the embrace phase. So I am on a curve.
Great, thank you.
Take it away, Erica.
Oh.
Thanks. Yeah, do we have my slides?
Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Erica Kemmerling. I'm from the Mechanical Engineering Department. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, sure. about my use of ChatGPT in my course, which is for undergrad mechanical engineering juniors. Next slide, please. So first of all, a little bit about this course. So all of our juniors are required to take it, and not all of them like it. It's often viewed as one of the less desirable engineering courses. Personally, I love it, but not all of the students do. So I have about 80 kids spread across 2 sections, and the subject matter is fluid mechanics and convective heat transfer. So for those who are unfamiliar, this is basically the physics of how liquids and gases move and the energy that they carry. Next slide, please. So I've been using AI in a lot of different ways in my course, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I just want to hone in on my overall learning goals for my students. First of all, I'd really like them to have some idea of how much AI actually knows about fluid mechanics and heat transfer as of now. So what does it do well? What does it do poorly? Sort of following from that, I'd like them to know whether a task is well suited for AI help. So if they have a new engineering task that they need to complete, is this something where they should not even think about using AI? Or is this something where AI might help them get started or even complete the entire task for them? And finally, I wanted to have them practice prompting AI a little bit and figure out the best way to ask it questions such that they get good results out of it. Because I noticed at the beginning of the semester, people were using it very much like they use Google. And as you all know by now, it's so much more than that. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to hone in a little bit on this one project that I did with AI, which was actually just this past week, and this was custom homework assignments. So the assignment for my students was that they were supposed to write their own homework problem that connected the material that we were doing in our course with their own personal lives. And the way that they did this was by having a conversation about it with ChatGPT. So they went to GPT, they said, hello, I'm an undergrad engineering student. I'm in this class where we are learning these specific things, and these are the things that I personally like. Can you help me come up with an open-ended engineering problem that connects these things together? And then they were supposed to actually solve the problem. So the reason that I was doing this is something that I have done manually in the past. There's a lot of research out there that shows that students learn better when they feel like the material they're learning is connected to their own personal lives. So in the past, I would survey the students. I'd ask them, what do you like to do when you're not in school? What are you interested in outside of engineering? And then I would write problems for them that connected it to the course material. Now, this worked well, but as you can imagine, it's a ton of work for me because I have so many students, and coming up with a good problem for each of them is really prohibitively time consuming. Also, I don't know the students as well as they know themselves. So I'll ask them what they're interested in, and they'll write down music, movies, and hanging out with friends. But a person is so much more than that. So I figured if they could do this for themselves, then they had a much broader view of what they liked and what they were interested in. So the learning goals for this specific assignment, first of all, I wanted them to engage in engineering brainstorming with ChatGPT because over the semester, this is something that we discovered it does well. It's one of the best things that it does. Also connect fluid mechanics and convection concepts to their own lives and practice the stuff that we'd done in class. So in solving these problems, they were actually reinforcing the things that I had taught them. Next slide, please. So I want to show a couple of examples of problems that the students actually got. And this first example is a pretty good one, I think. This is what I was hoping GPT would do. So this is a student who tells GPT that he's 21, he's from Lebanon, and he's interested in computers and gaming and watching videos about gaming and computers. And GPT came up with this problem for him, which I thought was really good. It was about designing a heat sink system for a computer. So this is good because it hits on a lot of the topics that we talked about in class. It's suggesting that he do a thermal analysis, look at airflow, think about the materials of the heatsink. These are all things that I had talked about in class and things that I think he could realistically do applying the things that I had taught him. And it's also very relevant to him because it really gets at something that he might want to do in real life. You know, a lot of the students build their own computers, are either making their own heat sinks or figuring out which heat sink they want to buy. So I think that this was really great. And I'd say about 80% of the problems were this level of quality where I was happy with them. Next slide, please. I also want to show one from the remaining 20%. So this is a really ridiculous problem that GPT came up with. So this student told GPT that she is interested in viola and fusion reactors. And instead of picking one or the other of those, it decided to combine them. So it's basically proposing that she put a fusion reactor inside her viola and then do some computations associated with that. So I think this is interesting on a couple of levels. First of all, it did technically follow the prompt and did what it asked for. It's asking her to do some calculations that would be relevant to the class and also to her interests. These are some things that she could technically do, but it's just way off base and that this is not something that you would ever think about doing in real life. So this was about 20% of the problems. Next slide, please. So the last part of the assignment was having the students write a reflection about how they felt about brainstorming with GPT and sort of what they got out of the experience and how they feel about using it in the future. And I got some very mixed feedback. Basically, everyone said that they thought it was a fun assignment. So I think I'll be keeping this and doing it in the future, especially given that AI is evolving so quickly and this might look very different next year. But a few things that the students said that I thought were interesting. I had a few people say they did not trust GPT, so they had to check the things that it said. And that actually made me happy because I feel like that's very, very critical. A couple of students observed that it has a very broad and shallow knowledge base. So it's really good at knowing something about a very wide variety of topics, but it's not so good on the details. One student observed that GPT was really good at sparking thoughts in herself. So she was able to do better brainstorming based on her conversation. I really liked that. And another student said that she was going to use GPT for brainstorming for her other final project. So I really like that because I feel like that's a takeaway that she'll be using in other parts of her education. All right, that's it.
So we'll start up with a question and ask you to just answer it in turn. So based on your own research and experience incorporating AI as you've just described, and also based on what you've heard today from your peers, from Cynthia's wonderful keynote, how would what does the future look like as far as sort of generally framing how you're going to think about using AI in the future, or maybe specific strategies? What has changed? It may be a big question, so maybe just pull one piece of it out of there.
All right, I guess I'll go first. One of the big things that I'm exploring right now with AI is its use in clinical instruction. So the examples that I gave you are from my non-clinical instruction, clinical courses. But being a healthcare professional and then teaching this interdisciplinary topic, I also teach in the regular veterinary curriculum. And because I teach in reproduction, incorporating AI can be challenging because of some of the ethics involved with it, but also thinking about AI in its use in healthcare in general. Veterinarians are not bound by HIPAA or some of the other patient privacy restrictions that I think the School of Medicine is evaluating and has put into policy. But for me, my next steps are looking at how AI, and in fact, today's my day of AI because our curriculum committee at the Cumming School is meeting this afternoon, and I am presenting as well to think about applications for AI in general clinical instruction, again, from conceptual understanding for students to how they might use it when they do enter clinical rotations, and thinking about problem lists and rule outs, differential diagnoses, and even developing treatment plans for patients. Is this appropriate or not? Where do we set our limitations? How might I think about using it when I go back? I do relief work, and so going back into practice or in the hospital, is there an area where I might be starting to think about using AI? Because I haven't yet, but we'll see. So for me, it's clinical instruction.
Great, thank you.
I guess I've been thinking just today about how I could be using this to even further tailor the fact that I teach classes that are very broad. They're like, my students in one of my classes are biologists and international relations people. Even in my core class that I teach in my department, my students range from environmental policy people to people who do active transportation planning. Like, they're very different types of people. And so it's making me think about how we could incorporate them using it to cater some of the material that we have in the class, or to spark the connection between what we're doing in class to the applications that they're going to be using. So that's sort of where I'm thinking about it. The other place that we've had some just, I think, offhanded comical discussions, but maybe some real things, is thinking about how these kinds of tools are going to get used in planning and policy practice. And that's an area that I think would be really interesting to explore, where these are tools that I use as friendly utilities for my job here. How are urban planners going to be using these as friendly utilities in their comprehensive planning processes? And where is that good and bad? And where is that replacing some voices that maybe should be at the table? Or how can it be used as a way of getting more voices to the table? So I think those are some of the places I've been thinking about it today.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Also, just about the timing, we actually have a little more time because we're going to do this Q&A, and Justin has another question for you. But then we also have another 10 minutes to do some Q&A with the audience. So we have time.
Yeah. All right. Great.
Thanks, Erica.
So something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I know this is a controversial idea, but that's the point of this symposium, so I'm going to bring it up anyway, is using AI to replace some basic student knowledge. So the reason I'm thinking about this is, in engineering, we have a problem where there are just a million required courses for the students. We basically make them know a little bit about everything. And the students don't want to know a little bit about everything. They often come in where they have a particular focus area and they really want to go into that in depth. And then we make them take all these other intro courses where they immediately forget stuff once they get out. So something I'm wondering about is, can we develop one course or a series of a couple of courses where we teach the students how to use AI to get the basic information that they would otherwise be learning in these intro courses that they don't want to take? And then that means that they don't have to take the courses and they can instead go deeper into the areas that they're actually interested in. Now, I don't know if our accreditation program would be okay with this. I also don't know whether it would actually work, but I think this is something that I would like to try and would like to look into in any way I can, because I think that one of the beauties of having AI and having this new tool that can do all these different things is we don't need to learn all of the mundane stuff ourselves if we are confident that AI can do it for us. So maybe this opens up opportunities for students to have deeper learning in the areas that really interest them.
Yes, very controversial. So our next question I have for you guys, and maybe some of the folks in the audience are thinking this too, is like, so are all of our classes AI classes now? Is it like an imperative that everyone here think about how they might incorporate it into their class? And if it is an imperative, how much time, obviously it's discipline specific, right? But like, what are your thoughts on incorporating it and how much it's necessary and how much time?
Yeah, I think my advice for my slide, the cautious incorporation, holds in this case. And we saw from the student responses, right? They want to hear about communication from professors. They want boundaries. They want usage guidelines. If you're not going to use it, why is that the case? And so I think cautiously incorporating it or setting those boundaries for the students and saying this is acceptable in this case versus not is going to be important. So having some sort of policy incorporated into a syllabi or your course content in some manner is going to be essential. I think now is the best time to do it. It will only continue to increase these questions from students, the feedback we're getting from them, as well as amongst our peers. So I would say, yes, cautious incorporation, and then some sort of policy or stance that gives these students the boundaries and communication that they're looking for.
I would generally agree, because I feel like my classes have gotten AI in them because that's stuff that I think about, and because it's stuff that either students are probably, at least a few of them, using, and it seems like an equity issue if all the students don't know that these tools exist and what they do and where to have barriers, like where to make your own choices and how to responsibly engage with them. But I don't necessarily think that everyone has to be using it as part of their class. But I agree that it should be part of at least the conversation, given that it is part of the set of tools that students have available to them to support learning and understanding where that intersects. And I think we will find that there are probably everyone in this room has some curiosity about it. There are probably just as many faculty who have never seen it in action or have no interest in touching it. And I think that's the place where we also have our personal interests and our personal experience with also starts to inform what goes on in classes. But I agree with you that we should at least be explicit about what we expect out of students, but also curious about what we can do and what that means.
So I think the answer to this question is no. I think every course is not an AI course. And that's because AI is not useful for every course yet. So I'm teaching graduate level heat transfer this spring. And I spent some time talking with various AIs about it. And I learned that AI is crap at graduate level heat transfer. So I don't put on my syllabus, you're not allowed to use a duck when you're taking your exam, because everyone knows a duck is not useful when you're taking a graduate heat transfer exam. And I think that right now that's where AI is with a lot of advanced STEM topics. It's just not helpful yet. So I'm okay telling my students that, saying, hey, if you want to use this, fine, but it's not going to help you. And I think that as AI develops and we get new iterations, we have to keep reevaluating this, because I fully expect that at some point it's going to be good at it. But we're not quite there yet.
Awesome.
Great, thank you. These insights are so helpful to everyone here and folks listening online, because we get these questions all the time. So thank you so much for sharing. So now we actually have time for some questions from our audience here and online. So.
Yeah, of course. I see a couple hands.
Is this working? Yes. I want to pick up on what Erica said about wanting to get rid of classes that teach basics. And I also want to go back to one of the students' comments that I don't trust the AI, that I think one of the reasons for having some of those basic courses has always been that, you wouldn't ask your neighbor across the hall who is a French major to help you with your math homework unless they happen to have peripheral skills. And knowing whether the answers you're getting are true or not is going to be absolutely critical. So Erica, you said, I like the idea eventually of getting rid of some of the basic information type things, but I'm still very worried about when that information will be accurate or not.
Yeah, so I think that that's a very good point. But I think that something that we can think about is teaching the students to check the accuracy of answers without actually teaching them the material. So something that I really wail on with my students is when you're asking AI a question, first ask it a question that you know the answer to that's similar and see how it does. So, I mean, that can come in a lot of different forms, right? Maybe you have a dynamics textbook and you ask it one of the example problems and say, walk me through this. And then you see whether what it does matches what the textbook did. And if it doesn't, then it's maybe not reliable. Whereas if it does exactly what the textbook did, then you might know that it's more reliable for doing the same type of problem. So I totally see what you're saying, but I'm wondering if maybe checking is a different skill set from actually knowing the material. And if that's the case, then it's a skill that can be applied to all different fields, whereas it would take much more time to actually learn the basics of all those different fields. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for this. I think we're still far away from it, but it is something that I think about as sort of a visionary idea.
Erica, I have a question for you right here. And I think Miguel online kind of has a similar question. And I'm really intrigued by what you did with your 80 student course and kind of personalized this assignment. I'm also a realist. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the time constraints that has imposed on you and how you might envision elucidating this creativity in students and using generative AI to do this while still being able to accomplish other things.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I can tell you that this was way faster than writing the problems. Grading the problems I'm still working on. And I actually tried to have ChatGPT do the grading for me. It did a terrible job. It gave everyone an A-, no matter how well or poorly they did. So that's not happening. I think really what it's about is having a smart grading rubric. So making sure that things are in a form where you can look at a solution and sort of check off, did they do X, Y, and Z? But I don't think that this personalized problem framework replaces traditional homework assignments. I think it's something where you throw out one homework assignment and do it one time. And hopefully the students will gain some skills from doing this once or twice, because yeah, it really is a lot in terms of grading. But at least I didn't have to write the problems. When I had to write them and grade them, it was 10 times worse. So, but yeah, you're right, it's a problem.
I saw a hand over here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your creativity and also the time you're taking to explain this to us. I'm really grateful. But one concern I have is how to teach writing. I'm in a different type of discipline. We read difficult philosophical works. I want to teach students how to think critically about them and then write about them. And I am of the view, and I could be persuaded otherwise, that really one doesn't do deep thinking about these texts until one is writing. And so to go to ChatGPT and put a prompt in and get something out would negate what I really want the students to learn. And I noticed, Professor Shakespeare, you don't allow students to use AI in creating assignments. So I'm wondering how we, as teachers, address this issue of writing. And it also raises all sorts of questions with regard to academic integrity. And I would just like to put that on the agenda to think about. And I could see, for example, just an anecdote. I have a course with 86 people in it. Long midterm, you need to answer one of these prompts, and I gave the rubric. We're going to be looking at a precise, do you have a precise thesis? Do you use evidence from the text? Does the evidence actually say what you say it says? And what I noticed is students didn't have a precise thesis. They told me generally what their topic was going to be. And I'm just interested if, would it be academically valid to have students take their first draft, put it in AI with the rubric, and see what one gets out of it. So it's just, I'm just interested in this topic and, where we go from here. Thanks.
So Rebecca, do you want to?
Yeah.
Start with this.
Yeah, because I do have a couple of thoughts in that space. So we said, please don't use this for your discussion board posts as well as your other assignments, because we, again, wanted students to be bringing themselves to class and doing the part of writing that is in many ways thinking.
Right.
And I think you raised some really good points that I've also experienced as I've used, as I said, I have a lot of experience using ChatGPT as just a utility. Our household pays for it, and we consider it in the household utility kind of category right now, because we use it for just like general things like, I need to write emails that sound like this to this kind of person, try, and then we fix it. But it becomes a challenge, and it's a challenge that I've been reflecting in myself of when have I stopped being the generator, and when am I now reacting to something that it has given me? I was feeling like that on my way over here today when I was thinking about how I used it to create, I think, a really cool final exam. And I know that most of it was me, and I know a little bit of it was some sparks that came from the corpus and the engineering behind ChatGPT 4. It's from my perspective as someone who also does a bunch of writing, it's part of thinking about what is the tool, like you were talking about. It's, you don't use a duck to do, what is it? To do heat transfer, you don't use a duck. You don't use this kind of a tool if you're trying to do your own thinking. You might use this kind of tool to refine your thinking. You might then also need a reflective process where you pause and think, what did it just give me, and what did I bring? And it's almost like it's making you do more thinking because you're engaging with it. And that's the place where I wonder where it might fulfill the the task of helping people advance in that reflection or refinement. But as for myself, I found myself very entangled of like, was that my idea? Where was this my word? I need to go back and check my logs to see if this was my idea first, or if this was the GPT's idea first.
Mira, do you want to follow?
I do have one comment. Excuse me. I think that you have value in those human prompts. So, excuse me. Of course. If you ask the students, if you permitted the use of AI, could you ask the students, for example, I'm gonna take a drink of water. Right. Could you have the students share what they put into AI, critique that output, and then share their reflective process, just as you were describing, in terms of this is my agency, right? This is what I'm putting into AI. This is what it's giving back. And this is how I'm going to reevaluate this and shape their writing as a conversation or as an editing tool or a brainstorming tool. I just think that there's a lot of learning happening by just what students are asking AI and then how they're reevaluating that you could potentially weave into your rubric or in terms of your evaluation.
See, I think this, you had your hand raised, and then
Hi, this is probably actually just going off of the last question. Outside of in the classroom and kind of integrity and kind of our learning goals, something I think that we were conversing about and struggling with is the extent that we should teach how to use these tools when there are still kind of ethical issues in society with going out and using them. For example, in the research space, major publications saying this is not something that you can use. In looking at grants, right? It's illegal to be using these tools to evaluate or help us evaluate grant writing process. And as especially scientists are thinking about intellectual property and how that translates, into a public space, how tentative or how much we should be thinking about the evolving ethics of using these tools in the classroom versus in real life when they may or may not be allowed. I'd just love to hear your reflections and kind of these different disciplines.
I would say just dive in.
Okay, I'll go. So I think this is really interesting and very field specific. I think there are some fields where, in particular engineering, because I'm an engineer, where the goal is really to use all of the tools that you have. So that includes all of the published research that's available and data and also anything that will help you make what you are making better. So I think AI is one of those tools. And I think a lot of engineering journals, and I can't speak for journals outside the field, but engineering journals in particular are now allowing AI to help with publications. And honestly, I think it's a good thing because I think that if it makes science communication better, then it can only help. And obviously it's important to cite sources and to follow rules. But I think that the main thing that I want to convey to my students is if you are in the real world and using this tool is allowed and it will help you, then you should do it because it's only going to get better. And I mean, if that means faster advancement, then I'm in favor.
Anyone?
I guess so. I'm torn because I've been a student and I know that as a student, you use the tools available to you and you engage with your ethical dilemmas and you engage with like, did I read enough of that article to cite it and make a clear and cogent argument about what its thesis was? And am I using it constructively in my own work? And I think these are things I still think about. And these are tools, but they're also tools that are only good at some things. And that's the place where I think learning about what they're good at and what they're not good at and weighing your own engagement with them. And again, I would go as far as weighing your engagement of, are you okay with the systems behind the software? Are you okay drawing from the corpus that this is pulling from, whichever of the engines you're using? Are you okay with the fact that it is indeed generating a need for even more server farms, which have their own specific impact on our environment and our well-being? But also, is it going to help you do a thing that was hard that you need to do that it's okay for, like emailing my daycare to be like, hey, how do I get, can my kid come in for an extra day? I don't know how to ask that question. And so that's a question I've asked my GPT to like write the email to my daycare, please, because it was something that was fast. It made something simpler for me and it got a thing done. Would I use that to make a comprehensive plan for a city? Would I use that to define my research? No. Have I given it half of an abstract for a paper I've written and watched it tell me what the methods I used were? Yeah, because that's interesting to see. But I think you sort of need to know what it can do and what it does in order to make responsible decisions about it, particularly given that we do get guidelines from different sources that are ultimately going to change a lot in the next chunk of time as this becomes more present, and as people have made more decisions about it. So I think that's the place where learning about it becomes an important factor of engaging with those guidelines and rules.
Sounds like a yes and. I saw two more people. Mira, did you want to?
No, go ahead. We can.
Blue sweatshirt and then.
Thank you all so much for being here. Like, I'm learning a lot as someone that will hope to be a future educator. I do have a general question, but I think the answers might be tailored depending on the stage of the student. Have you all noticed that there's any sort of shifts in terms of mental health outcomes in terms of like students, they're so stressed about doing all these assignments and like juggling all these classes. Like, do you think that students that use AI as a tool have these like better frameworks of terms of pursuing their education versus those that are just like so swamped and thinking of it as a chore? I don't know if this question even makes sense, but like, do you think that like students are less stressed if they're using AI as a tool? Like, are there any sort of marked assessments saying, oh, like these students generally have, less stress levels? Like, do they see counseling and mental resources in terms of just like having their classes be a source of stress for them? Like, do you think that this is changing as well with the advent of AI?
So I've got an answer for this. So one of the things that I do with my class is I do mental health checks on students. So the way this works is every time we have a class session, I have my students do a 1-question mini quiz. So nominally it's to keep track of where they are in the material and how they're understanding stuff. But it's not for a lot of points. And honestly, the reason that I keep doing them is because of the questions I ask after the content question, which is I ask, how are you feeling today? And is there anything else you'd like to tell me? And many, many students leave those fields blank, but some of them really go into detail about their current mental health state and what they're dealing with. And I think that, so this is nice because I have comparison between these checks before I was using AI and after I started using it. And I do actually think that the AI helps. So I allow my students to use ChatGPT on their homeworks. They just have to turn in the conversation they had with it. It doesn't do the whole problems for them. It's just not that good at engineering yet, but it's really good at helping them get started on stuff. And I have seen several instances of students writing on their mental health checks that the homework stressed them out less because they had this extra opportunity to help them get started when they had time to work on the assignment, which might have been at 1:30 a.m. on a Saturday, and no TAs are available and I'm not checking my email then. So I think it's helped my students, but that's only one specific class. So I'd be curious to hear what the others say.
Yeah, so I have a very small cohort of students that are in this 4-year dual degree program. So they're double stressed because they've got 2 degrees to accomplish in a equal time span. And but I get to know them really well. I mentor them, I oversee their research and their learning goals and everything for 4 years. So it's really enjoyable in that sense for me to get to know my students over that time period. And I feel like as graduate students, when they come in, are so overwhelmed by everything that they, at least right now, my first years are not even thinking about AI. They're just trying to get, this first semester under their belt. And the curriculum only continues to pick up into second and third year, where it gets just more granular and a lot more overwhelming for these students. And I see my second and third years relying on AI more and more just to accomplish, again, some of these baseline, whether it's utilities, right, or just like personal life management. And then in a professional sense or in their learning sense, outlining and brainstorming and then conceptual understanding is really where I'm seeing a lot of this for students. So yes, I feel like when I talk to my students, I hear more about their use of AI in their second and third years of this education, because they just need that support as they would rely on a lot of other tools, versus what I see right now, at least with my first years. And I'm curious to see how that progresses, just because of this, the novelty that I guess that AI still is.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more. Yeah. These are great questions.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. All right, go ahead, Ellen.
I want to build on question here by Vicky, comment that Rebecca made in her response. And for me, it's circling back to concerns I've had from the earliest points that I've learned about AI. And today, I learned some ways that I can use it, and I'm more interested and maybe excited about some of these ways. And yet I still wrestle with, what does it mean ethically for us to have students learning, using these sources when it's so challenging to know the bias that's baked into these platforms. And I would really appreciate an opportunity for some ongoing conversation around that, because I think that simply understanding how it works and the way it works is important. But I think each of us has an ethical obligation to think about how we do use this, and how we teach our students to use it, and how we teach our students to wrestle with the ethical obligation of the way in which they use it as well. So I don't know if that's a question, but it's a plea.
It's such an important topic, Ellen. Thanks for bringing it up. And I know CELT is, going to be having opportunities for discussion around it. It's something we talk about all the time when we present about how to use the technology. So maybe just to sort of wrap things up, if one of you has talked with your students about, keeping an eye out for bias in the outputs that they're getting, just as a way to sort of begin that discussion or continue that discussion.
Yeah, so I will say that the example that I presented of using this in a class and having students evaluate the output was part of an introduction to an assignment where they were evaluating the voices and perspectives in other documents that they were analyzing as part of a project. And so I think being cognizant of that is training that is necessary, because everything that we read, regardless of how unbiased we say that it is, contains a perspective. And I think being cognizant that even though these tools can sound really friendly and they're very appealing, like it feels good to get some feedback to get something. But I think having the space to realize that it is another form of media, it's generated using a certain way of creating information, and then questioning it. And I think I was lucky that we got a great quote in ours to be able to really flag to students immediately that it was taking a stance that was not necessarily a universal stance. I think media literacy and content literacy and thinking about where bias is in anything it continues to be a really important skill. So I think and I agree, we should keep having these conversations.
Thank you. And thank you to all our panelists and to Freedom for Justin for running this panel.